Hi everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor, political commentator, and also an advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. So thank you so much for coming on the program again, Marandi.
Thank
Um,
you, Glenn.
we see now that Israel, well, quite evidently, is pushing for a war with Iran, while it appears that the United States prefers a diplomatic solution. But in the news, it's reported that a strange compromise might appear as Israel is considering a limited strike on Iran, which would require limited US support. Uh, what do you make of these reports, and how close are we actually to a war now, do you think?
It's very difficult to say. I think that inside the United States, as I've been saying over the past few weeks and especially few days, there is a large coalition of elites that want war, whether it is the Democratic Party and the liberals who show signs that they are pushing for war, or part of the Republican elite, or whether it's the neocons and the Zionists and the usual suspects. Uh, this huge coalition is pushing for war. The reason why I think many of Trump's opponents are seeking wars simply because they want Trump to fail. That's how I interpret it. So you see John Kerry. Uh, I haven't read the article, but I've been told that he wrote a piece where he was saying that this is not enough, that the path that Trump is taking, uh, Iran is weak, Iran is vulnerable, and so we have to take a lot from Iran. And other articles, like in the New York Times and elsewhere, where they're constantly saying that Iran has no air defenses, uh, which basically implies that Trump should be able to threaten Iran with ease and get what he wants. And while it is nonsense that Iran has no air defenses or that its air defenses have been weakened, in fact, I would argue that Iran's air defenses today are significantly stronger than they were 6 months ago or a year ago. But the point is that these people want to push for war for different reasons. In the case of the neocons and the Zionists, it's very clear. In the case of some of these Republicans and the Democrats, I think their animosity towards Trump, along with their close affiliation with Zionism, and many of them being neocons, has made it obvious why they would push in that direction. But the reality is that people in the know, the more sane actors, especially I would assume in the Pentagon, would be saying that a war with Iran would lead to defeat. It would be catastrophic for the world. It would be something that would be very damaging to Iran as well, but it would be a defeat for the United States. And I think that is basically what is holding uh, things back. And so perhaps what you are asking has something to do with that, and that this is some sort of compromise move where the Israeli regime carries out a strike, the Americans help them, because without the Americans, the Israelis cannot do anything. They're much weaker than they are depicted. And the previous strike on Iran was carried out with the support of the Americans in a way in which you could say that the Americans did the heavy lifting, whether it was defending the regime against drones in the first Iranian counterstrike, or whether it was the Israeli regime carrying out or attempting to carry out an airstrike against Iran. The Americans did the uh, heavy lifting. Uh, but a limited strike, I guess, would be some sort of compromise. But again, it could also be that this is being used as a tool to gain concessions from Iran at the negotiating table. You know, the mad dog uh, uh, out there is we're holding it back, or there's a threat that the mad dog would attack. And Israel is, of course, a mad dog. We see in Gaza that it is a mad dog. But it's not going to, if that is the objective, it's not going to impact the Iranian negotiating position. An Israeli attack would not do any major damage to Iran. It would any attack would do damage, but it's not. I mean, you know the Ukrainian Russian-Ukrainian war. It's been going on for well over 3 years. Bombings day and night, drone attacks, missile attacks, artillery attacks. For well over 3 years now. And both countries are still there. Huge damage, but a few airplanes firing off missiles from over Iraqi airspace are not going to make any major create any major difficulties for Iran. And of course, the Iranian response would be far more effective because Iran has an enormous missile and drone capability, which Glenn, I should point out that over the past few months, the Iranians have been putting a lot of money in their missile capability, their drone capability, their underground defense sites, and their air defense capabilities. And I think that is because they are preparing themselves for war, but also they are using their experience through their own strikes against the Israeli regime and through the strike that was carried out against Iran to upgrade and to be able to better have a more effective military in future. So I think that if there is a major war, I have no doubt that the Americans would lose, especially at a time when they have so many economic difficulties and they're marginalized across the world because of trade war. They have problems in Ukraine, and their image across the world has been shattered by Gaza. I think that it would be catastrophic for the Americans, probably more than anyone else. And a limited war or a limited strike by the Israeli regime would be catastrophic for the Israeli regime because the Iranians already owe the regime one, and they will definitely take this as an opportunity to hit very hard. And it does not serve the interests of the Israeli regime. The only person who benefits is Netanyahu, who wants to remain in power and who needs all these wars to remain in power. I think there's a major miscalculation, by the way, Glenn, in the United States, and that is that Iran has been weakened. Iranian so-called proxies are weakened, and Iran has been weakened. And this is something that I always take issue with. In war, everyone is weakened. In Ukraine and Russia, the Ukraine-Russia war, Russia has been weakened. When you're fighting a war, people die, you lose manpower, you lose equipment, you're weakened, but everything is relative. Hezbollah has been hurt, but so has the Israeli regime. Hamas has been hurt, but so has the Israeli regime. The Israeli regime's image has been completely shattered, which I think is more important than anything else. And in the case of Syria, Syria really over the last few years wasn't much of an ally to Iran anymore. And I think the mess now in Syria is pretty harmful for the West. And Iran no longer pays for oil and for the comfort of to help ordinary Syrians. It's out of the country, so that money is spent elsewhere. And in the case of Yemen, I think it's the reverse. Yemen has emerged very powerful, and the Americans have shown themselves to be far less capable than they presented themselves to be.
Yeah, well, one can also add that the United States has launched a few expensive war games against Iran, where the outcome was quite devastating for the Americans, where they ended up, yes, looking well, sitting there like sitting ducks for the Iranians. So I assume that in the Pentagon they are less optimistic than some of the war hawks in Washington. Um, but there seems to be this assumption of escalation dominance that can bomb a little bit and then Iran will be deterred out of fear of a larger war, so it will prevent it from retaliating. But with all of this, if you're correct that this is merely, yeah, I guess, negotiation tactics to have more cards to put pressure on Iran to make greater concessions in any negotiations. Well, beyond this, what is actually happening with Iran's alignment in the world? Because I'm seeing more and more indications that Iran is aligning itself closer with both China and Russia in economics as well as security. I guess economics will be closer with China as it's more in that direction with the economic sanctions, but the security we see from both Syria and Ukraine that the Iranians and the Russians have been becoming closer and closer. Do you see a trilateral partnership there emerging as a response to this, or are we reading too much into this?
I don't rule out a strike at all, whether an American strike or a strike by Netanyahu. Uh, what I'm saying is that it is a possibility that the threats are, I mean, it is definitely the case that the threats are being used to gain concessions, but it is possible that these threats may lead to military conflict and it may not lead to military conflict. The Iranians are planning for the worst, and they know that if the Americans strike, they have to have, and if the Israelis strike, they will have to have a very credible response. And as I think alluded to, the Persian Gulf region is very vulnerable. It is, if anyone looks at the map, it is not very wide, and the Iranians control one side of it. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf. And all the oil and gas installations that we see, almost all of them are right alongside the coast or are in the Persian Gulf. And the ships, the tankers, um, they pass right in front of Iran. So these are all glass palaces. Qatar is a country of 350,000 people. It's a town, it's a small city in Iran. Or the Emirates has a population, a passport holding population of like 1,100,000, 200,000 people, a mid-sized city in Iran. And of course, the whole Persian Gulf is just incapable of defending itself. And since they have American bases all across the region, not only are American soldiers vulnerable, but so are these regimes. And that, any conflict could quickly lead to the collapse of all of uh, these regimes. And of course, let us assume that there is chaos in the Persian Gulf, no more oil exports from there. Then imagine how the balance of power in Yemen between Saudi Arabia and Yemen would change, and the role that the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, what effect they could have. So, and these regimes in the Persian Gulf, they have many more foreign indentured servants and slaves and workers there than they have from their own population. The foreign population is much larger. So you could have dramatic change across the Arabian Peninsula, literally within days and definitely weeks. And that could change the region forever, permanently at least, in for the next decade or two. And that would that would bring down the global economy. And the US economy, as I said earlier, which already has huge challenges facing it, I don't think I don't think it can survive. And militarily, when these regimes collapse, all those US bases will be swept away. So I think that is a sort of mad theory that we used to have during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and Iran. We have this sort of state of affairs today that if the worst case scenario would mean the end of oil from the Arabian Peninsula, perhaps the Caucasus too, and I think that would be catastrophic for the West, the United States in particular. So what we have right now is the United States and the Iranians negotiating. So far, the first two meetings seem to have gone well, but I don't think we should read too much into that. I think that it's quite possible that this may be a tactic used by the United States, and then they're going to turn nasty in the coming days. That's a possibility. I have no idea what's going on, obviously, inside the White House or planning in the United States, but the United States under Trump has shown itself to be extremely unpredictable. And the United States has always been very deceitful, whether under Trump or otherwise. So it's wait and see for the Iranians. If the Americans do the smart thing, if they recognize Iran's rights, what any normal country would do, which the United States isn't, then I think the path forward is not all that complicated, actually. But if the United States is seeking ways to undermine Iran's position and to take Iran's sovereignty away from it, it's just not going to work.
And in terms of the larger great power configuration, do you see Iran aligning itself closer with China and Russia?
Sorry, I was going to answer that, but then I saw I talked so much
Oh yeah.
that I thought maybe I should stop and see if you want me to continue. I think that the Iran, with regards to defense capabilities, it is prepared for war. It would fight its own wars. It doesn't need like the Russian soldiers or Chinese soldiers or anyone's soldiers. And Iran's allies across the region, especially in Iraq, especially in Iraq, and in Yemen, as we're seeing, they will have an enormous role to play if there is war. Uh, so, and they would change the map very swiftly. Iran itself, therefore, would be more than capable of firing off missiles, bringing down jets, uh, firing hundreds of thousands of drones. Uh, that is a fact. But Iran's relationships with powers like Russia and China are very important. Russia, China today are much closer to Iran than they've ever been before, thanks to the United States. Many thanks to the United States. The war in Ukraine has evolved the relationship. The trade war with China has further evolved the relationship between Iran and China. And it's not just Iran and Russia and China. Trump himself has brought about a lot of concerns. Remember, just a decade ago, it was the countries in the Persian Gulf, these family dictatorships, uh, at least some of them, who are calling on the United States to attack Iran. Now they are terrified of war. The world has changed. So you saw the Saudi defense minister, the brother of Mohammed bin Salman, and of course the son of the king, come to Tehran just a few days ago. There are many reasons for the trip, but part of it is the fear that war would come about and it would, it would sweep all these regimes away. Iran doesn't want war, so Iran wants a good relationship with all of its neighbors. But the fact is that countries across the region and across the world increasingly see the United States as weak, relatively speaking, unable to determine the fate of other countries, unable to impose their will. We've seen that in the trade war. We've seen that in Ukraine. We've seen that in all of its endless wars across the region. But also, they see Trump as a destructive force. Trump is very good at marginalizing the United States. His image is something that is very harmful for the United States. And in fact, that strengthens the Iranian government not only with regards to its relationships with major powers, regional powers, and countries across the world, but it also helps the Iranian government keep the population united because Trump simply does not have the soft power that someone like Obama did when he was president. Uh, Obama was more effective in hypocrisy and divide and rule. He had much more soft power capability, which gradually diminished. But Trump has no soft power capability. And that very, very little soft power capability that he gained by imposing a ceasefire in Gaza, he destroyed by himself by giving Netanyahu the green light to restart the genocide and by calling for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So Trump strengthens Iran both at home because the population sees him as insane. I'm not saying that he is, but ordinary people see him as abnormal, as unpredictable, as someone who changes his mind, who cannot be trusted. And that helps the Iranian government and the political establishment to keep the people united. But it also changes perceptions about it has changed perceptions about the Iran US relationship across the world. People, countries across the world that are facing US tariffs for no reason, they better understand Iran's position today with regards to the United States.
Well, my last question is about the actual diplomacy, though, because if there is this well diplomatic alternative which yeah, the U.S. wants to pursue, what would actually diplomacy between the United States and Iran look like? Is there any prospect for direct talks? And I guess what could actually be achieved? Because it appears the United States has put very unacceptable demands on Iran. In other words, it should, to some extent, disarm itself at the same time as they're threatening to attack Iran. So there's some internal contradictions there. But is there a possibility for direct talks, or is it too difficult or impossible for both sides?
Well, we've had episodes or periods when we had direct talks with the United States in the past, and I won't go over that history. You know it as well as I. But the latest was the JCPOA, where we had extensive direct talks. In general, the Iranians don't want direct talks for now because they want they're using this as leverage. The Americans want direct talks. The Iranians are saying, no, we'll have indirect talks. This is to tell the Americans that, sort of that we're not very interested. But if you behave well at the negotiating table during the indirect talks, then somewhere down the road that could change. Also, the reason why the Iranians imposed Oman, whereas the Americans wanted UAE to be the place where the negotiations were held, was because Oman is closer to Iran, and because the Iranians also wanted to tell them that you cannot dictate terms to us. Because the Americans want to disarm Iran, they want to take away Iran's defense capabilities, Iran's relationships. Iran is saying you can't even impose uh, where the negotiations are held, and you cannot impose direct negotiations. So it's implying that you're not going to impose these on us either. But these are symbolic, but they're significant. I think it is possible that we would have direct negotiations at some point, depending on the behavior of Trump and his team. If they become realistic, if they're realistic, they recognize that Iran's relationships and defense capabilities are off the table, and if they recognize the fact that Iran won't give up its sovereign right to have a peaceful nuclear program within the framework of international law, everything is possible. But when it comes to the United States, the obvious is often uh, that which becomes unattainable. Just like in Ukraine, where it's obvious that this war should end swiftly, but the Americans can't seem to get themselves to, or at least Trump can't seem to have the courage to make the right decision. The trade war obviously has turned out to be a catastrophic mistake, but they can't uh, make the decision to rectify this. The United States is not a country that makes very good decisions. It makes often insane decisions, but because of its arrogance and also this lingering mentality of American exceptionalism, especially among elites, they think that somehow they can just, if they just keep pushing and pushing and banging their heads against the wall, that the wall will come down. But this is not a policy that will succeed. Uh, the only, I think, the only path forward for the United States is to accept Iran's sovereignty, Iran's rights, and to come to a reasonable deal. But I think there's another thing in the background, and that is that, Glenn, this was never about Iran's nuclear program. This was never about human rights. This was never about terrorism. This has always been about Iran's support for the Palestinian people. That's why Iran has been antagonized. That's why The United States supported Saddam Hussein against Iran. That's why the United States has been sanctioning Iran for decades. Even during the JCPOA, the United States refused to remove the sanctions that they promised to do. The antagonism towards Iran lies elsewhere. And this antagonism is detrimental to US interests, and it basically shows, like in other places, that the Israeli regime is a burden to the United States. But because of the enormous influence that they have in Washington, that is something that is not going to be easily recognized.
It's a key curse of the unipolar moment of us that when you're the global hegemon, you can absorb a lot of cost. So, yeah, that results in a foolish decision not necessarily being reversed. This could be part of the reason why there's this tendency to always double down as opposed to recognize the wrong course and correct it. But yeah, it remains to be seen. Anyways, Professor Marandi, it's always fascinating to speak with you, so thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me, Glenn. I hope to see you soon.